Why would a medieval census be called the Book of Doom? In 1086, William the Conqueror ordered every village, every farm, every person in England to be counted and recorded. But when the English saw what he'd created, they didn't call it a census. They called it Doomsday, Judgment Day. Because like the biblical apocalypse, there was no appealing its verdict. This wasn't just England's first census. This was the blueprint for total control, disguised as paperwork. And make sure you stay until the end, because the connections between this medieval surveillance system and what's happening today will leave you questioning everything. "20 years after Hastings, William the Conqueror had conquered England but couldn't control it. He didn't know who owned what, who owed what taxes, or which lords might be hiding wealth to fund rebellion. In medieval politics, ignorance was death. So in 1085, William made a decision that would echo through history. He would count everything. Every village, every acre, every cow, every pig. Nothing in England would escape his gaze. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the scope with barely concealed horror. So very narrowly did he have it investigated, it is shameful to tell, that there was not one single hide, nor one virgate of land, nor one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig that was left out. Even the chronicler felt shame describing the survey's thoroughness. This wasn't record-keeping. This was something that violated the natural order. Royal commissioners descended on every shire with parchments and questions. But here's what made it terrifying. They didn't just ask the lords, they questioned peasants who'd never spoken to authority higher than their local reeve, demanding testimony under oath about land their families had worked for generations. To peasants in a world where books were rare and mysterious, seeing royal scribes record their names felt godlike. Some believed they were witnessing the beginning of the end times, and maybe they were right. The name didn't come immediately. For decades, it was simply the King's Book. But by the 12th century, a new name had emerged from whispered conversations: Doomsday, Judgment Day. Why would a tax record earn a name reserved for the end of the world? Because like the Last Judgment itself, the book's verdict was final and eternal. If the book said you owned 30 acres, you owned 30 acres. If it said you owed £12 in tax, you owed £12. There was no appeal, no higher court, no possibility of revision. The Church found this deeply unsettling. Only God was supposed to possess complete knowledge. Only the divine eye could see all things, judge all souls. The idea that a human ruler could catalogue every possession and name every person felt like blasphemy dressed up as bureaucracy. To medieval minds, books weren't neutral objects. They carried mystical power. The Bible contained God's word. A book that claimed to record every living thing in an entire kingdom seemed to claim divine authority for human purposes. The people of England recognized they were living through their own judgment day, where every detail of their lives was being inscribed for all time. And like the biblical apocalypse, there would be no escape from its verdict. If this is stirring something deeper than just historical curiosity, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell, because what William created next would make the name Book of Doom seem like an understatement. Let's strip away the medieval mysticism and look at what the Doomsday Book really was. The most sophisticated instrument of control ever devised by a European ruler. Before the survey, William's knowledge of England was patchy, dependent on Norman lords who might lie and Saxon officials who might rebel. After the survey, William possessed something unprecedented: perfect information. He knew exactly who owned every hide of land in England. He could identify lords claiming poverty while hoarding wealth, villages underreporting resources, estates that might support rebels. This wasn't just record-keeping, this was the birth of the surveillance state. Consider the psychological impact. Every village had been visited by royal officials, every family questioned, every possession recorded. The message was unmistakable. The king's eyes could reach anywhere, his authority could catalogue any secret. William could now redistribute land with surgical precision. If resources were needed for war, the book calculated exactly how much each region could provide. If a potential rebel needed weakening, the book identified his assets down to the last chicken. The parallels to modern data collection are impossible to ignore. What William created with parchment and scribes, we've recreated with databases and algorithms. The same principle operates. To control a population, you must first catalogue it. Perhaps most chilling was what happened to those not recorded. If your name didn't appear in the Doomsday Book, you had no legal existence. You couldn't prove ownership, couldn't establish rights, couldn't appeal to royal justice. You were a ghost in your own country. Villagers lived in terror of the book's errors as much as its truths. Being undercounted might mean your land could be granted to someone else. Being overcounted could crush you with impossible taxes. Either way, once sealed in Winchester, those records would outlive kings, outlive dynasties, outlive the very people they documented. Here's where the official story starts to crack and the whispers begin. The Doomsday Book that survives today consists of 2 main volumes: Great Domesday, containing abbreviated returns for most of England, and Little Domesday, preserving full records for Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Together, they represent one of the most complete records of medieval society ever created. But what if what we have is only part of the story? Medieval chronicles hint at other records, other books compiled alongside the main survey. References appear to black books, containing information too sensitive for the main record. Some chroniclers mention sealed rolls kept separate from the general survey, accessible only to the king and his most trusted advisors. What could have been so dangerous that it needed separation from a record that already terrified the population? Think about the scope of William's investigation. His commissioners didn't just count livestock, they interviewed people, recorded testimony, gathered intelligence. In a conquered nation where rebellion simmered beneath the surface, they would have collected far more than tax data. They would have identified potential rebels, recorded which Saxon families harbored resentment, noted which villages might shelter resistance fighters. These lost records might have contained the names of suspected dissidents, locations of hidden weapons, identities of Saxon nobles who posed ongoing threats. Information too explosive for the main record, but too valuable to discard. The secrecy surrounding the survey's compilation feeds these suspicions. The commissioners worked in closed sessions. Their methods were kept confidential. Even local officials who helped gather information were often prevented from seeing the final records. If secret volumes existed, they were either destroyed or hidden so well that centuries of scholarship haven't uncovered them. But the persistent legends and unexplained gaps in the surviving record suggest the Doomsday Book we know may be only the public face of a much more extensive intelligence operation. To understand why the Doomsday Book inspired such terror, we need to step inside the medieval mind, where knowledge itself was dangerous territory. Medieval society operated on the principle of divine limits. God knew all things, but mortal rulers were supposed to know only what they needed to govern justly. Kings who sought to know too much, who claimed divine levels of omniscience, were walking the path of fallen angels who had challenged heaven itself. And that's exactly what the Doomsday Book represented, a human attempt to achieve divine omniscience. Consider what William had accomplished. He knew the name of every landholder in England. He could calculate the wealth of any village, the resources of any estate. He possessed information that no previous king had ever commanded, knowledge that seemed to approach the all-seeing eye of God himself. The peasants understood this instinctively. They lived in a world where names held power, where to speak something aloud was to give it reality, where the act of recording could transform the temporary into the eternal. When William's scribes wrote down their names, their possessions, their relationships, they were performing a kind of secular sorcery, capturing souls in ink and binding them to parchment. This is why they called it the Book of Doom, not because it predicted the future, but because it seemed to have stolen something essential from the people it recorded: their privacy, their autonomy, their right to exist without supervision, all sacrificed to feed William's hunger for perfect knowledge. The clergy's reaction was more complex but equally disturbed. They recognized the theological implications. The Doomsday Book represented a secular challenge to divine authority, a human claim to the kind of perfect knowledge that should belong to God alone. Medieval theology took seriously the idea that certain kinds of knowledge were forbidden to mortals. The Doomsday Book seemed to violate these sacred boundaries, suggesting that the line between human and divine power might be thinner than anyone had dared to imagine. And if you're seeing how this connects to our own age, make sure you're subscribed. Because the parallels between medieval surveillance and modern data collection are more unsettling than most people realize. Nearly 1,000 years later, the Doomsday Book still exists. You can see it today in the UK National Archives, 2 massive volumes bound in medieval leather, their pages filled with the names of people who died centuries ago. Historians treat it as a priceless window into medieval society, but its aura has never been neutral. The church never quite knew what to do with the book. While bishops and abbots were recorded alongside secular landholders, the ecclesiastical hierarchy maintained careful distance from the survey's methods. They allowed the apocalyptic nickname to stand unchallenged, neither embracing nor rejecting the book's association with divine judgment. This careful ambiguity speaks volumes. If the survey had been purely administrative, the church would have had no reason for discomfort. But something about the Doomsday Book touched nerves that ran deeper than politics or taxation. Modern historians have tried to demystify the book, to strip away medieval superstitions and focus on its historical value. They treat the fear it inspired as an understandable but irrational response to innovation. But this interpretation misses something crucial. The people who named it the Book of Doom were responding to something real. The Doomsday Book represented a fundamental shift in the nature of power, the birth of authority based on information rather than tradition, surveillance rather than consent. It anticipated every development we associate with the modern state. Systematic taxation, centralized administration, the ability to track individuals across boundaries. In the 11th century, such capabilities seemed supernatural. Today, we call them normal. We carry devices that track our movements and record our communications with precision that would have amazed William's commissioners. We submit to surveillance systems that know more about our daily lives than the Doomsday Book ever recorded about medieval peasants. The tools have evolved, but the principle remains unchanged. Perfect knowledge enables perfect control. And once authority migrates to those who possess the data, it rarely returns to those who don't. Maybe the medieval English were right to call it the Book of Doom. Maybe they saw something in William's great survey that we've forgotten how to fear. The Doomsday Book wasn't terrifying because it was inaccurate. It was terrifying because it was perfectly true. A book that knew everything about everyone, that left no room for escape, no corner for privacy, no space where authority couldn't reach. It transformed human beings into entries on parchment, reducing the complexity of life to numbers that could be calculated, manipulated, and controlled by distant powers. For the first time in English history, ordinary people found themselves living under the gaze of perfect surveillance. Their names were known, their possessions catalogued, their relationships mapped. The book promised that this knowledge would last forever, that future kings would consult these records, that their descendants would be bound by decisions made in 1086. And they were right to be afraid. The Doomsday Book did create a new form of power. It proved that information could be more valuable than armies, that knowledge could be more dangerous than swords. William conquered England twice, once with Norman cavalry and once with royal clerks carrying parchment and ink. The question isn't just what secrets the Doomsday Book contained. The question is whether we recognize the Book of Doom we're writing today. With every digital transaction, every tracked movement, every recorded conversation, are we the authors of our own surveillance, the scribes of our own subjugation? The medieval English feared the book because they knew that once such complete records existed, freedom would become a memory. They understood that perfect knowledge and human liberty couldn't coexist in the same kingdom. And here we are, 1,000 years later, carrying our own surveying devices in our pockets, volunteering information that would have taken William's commissioners years to gather. We've created the surveillance state the medieval world could only imagine as a nightmare. The only difference is that we call it convenience. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think we're living in the age of a new Doomsday Book, one written in data instead of ink? And subscribe to Ancient Underworld, because the patterns of power never really change, they just learn new languages.